Good day, everyone. I greet you in the awesome, able, and almighty name of the Lord Jesus Christ. I am Dr. Claybon Lee Jr., Senior Pastor of the Mount Calvary Baptist Church of Fairfield in Suisun City, California. And this is a special edition of Dialogue with Doc. In the past, we've had Dialogue with Doc, where we've talked about various issues and things that are going on in our world and affecting our church. And today is a special edition because today we're going to focus our attention on the COVID-19 vaccine. And I am really excited and grateful to God to be able to have one of our very own who grew up in our church, who is now an accomplished physician in her own right, Dr. Keedra McNeil Sales, to join us. So welcome, Keedra. Say hello to everybody and just tell everybody a little bit about you and what the Lord has done to bless your life in your area of profession.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Lee, for having me. I'm just very excited that we're able to have this discussion this evening and really be able to share this information with our community, with the African-American community in particular. So as you mentioned, I am a pediatrician at Kaiser Permanente in Fairfield, and I'm also the newly appointed Assistant Physician-in-Chief for Culturally Responsive Care and Inclusion for the Napa Solano service area for Kaiser Permanente. And so essentially what that means is I have the opportunity to engage with our colleagues, with our patients, with our staff, with our community to make sure that we all have the tools that we need to care the best that we can for ourselves in our respective places and communities, as well as to have understanding of each other, knowing that we all don't come from a monolithic background. And of course, we should not all be provided medical care or medical treatment in, kind of a cookie cutter or monolithic way. So that is the gist of my role and my responsibility. And what I've really been focusing on these last couple of months is making sure that the community, particularly communities of color, have the information that we need at hand in order to combat the COVID-19 virus and to understand as best as we can the COVID-19 vaccine that's now available.
That's excellent. So one of the things that I've shared with our church is that as we go through this pandemic, that there are three things at a minimum that we need to be constantly giving our attention to. One is the sovereignty of God, two is science, and three is sense, as in good sense, just common sense, as we go through this. And one of the things that is interesting about your new role is your opportunity to inform both the medical field as well as the general public that there aren't cookie cutters as it relates to individuals' health, and that cultural backgrounds and ethnic identities and origins really are vitally important to providing the appropriate and best care for patients. And so I think that's absolutely wonderful for you to be able to have that opportunity. Yes, yes. So as you've been working with different communities and trying to share information, how important is education, not in terms of going to school in this instance, but education in terms of information for the public as it relates to their health and opportunities for them to perpetuate good health?
Absolutely. So education is paramount, and not just for COVID-19, but for your general health, and especially if you do have chronic medical conditions or other medical conditions that are not chronic, making sure that you yourself as the patient are partnering with your provider to ensure that you are receiving the best care possible. Because kind of the old way of medicine was, the physician was up here and the patient was down here, and the physician is basically just telling the patient what it is that needs to be done. So in this day, it is most important, as we mentioned, because everybody is not coming from the same background, coming from the same, cultural group, social group, et cetera. It's important to make sure that those partnerships are in place and that they're dynamic. And so it's really, I think, one of the biggest things to realize as a patient, that you should have an equal say in your healthcare as much as your provider. I mean, of course, you don't have the ability to prescribe yourself a medication or do surgery on yourself. But if you need a procedure, if you need a medication, if you have an illness, you want to make sure that you are in dialogue with your provider or providers so that you guys are on the same page with regards to the plan of care. And unfortunately, especially in communities of color and the African American community, since this has not always been the case, our communities have not always felt as though we were in a place where we were being respected or being informed appropriately or being treated in a manner as perhaps, let's say, a Caucasian patient. And so if you are in that position, and I'm sure anybody can think about family members or friends or even themselves who've had negative experiences in going to the doctor, if you're in that position, then please, I always encourage you to find another provider. There's other doctors who are out there, other nurses, whoever the case may be. So then there will be that person who can partner with you. And sometimes people don't necessarily realize that. They think they're just kind of stuck with whoever they were assigned with or whoever their insurance said. But no, you have the ability, regardless of what your coverage is, to find someone that you feel resonates best with you. I'll even use myself as an example. I had 2 African American female physicians as my primary care providers, and I didn't feel as though that connection was there. And so I ended up switching 2 times. And ironically, my primary care physician now is a young white male who is very responsive, is very respectful, is very thorough in his approach. And so it doesn't even necessarily have to be someone from the same background, but just someone who's really willing to listen and to work with you, because that's what's needed in the end for all of us.
Well, that's great. So say something to us about the importance of this COVID-19 vaccine. It's now a year that we've been dealing with this pandemic. And African Americans, people of color, are at the top of the charts as it relates to those who have contracted the virus as well as died from the virus. And so for the general population, but especially for communities of color, speak to us about the importance of the vaccine.
No, I think that is a really, really important point to make, because of the fact that, as you mentioned, throughout this entire year, and it's been a long year for everybody, right? All of these different changes that we've had to make, all of these adjustments, and just not having that semblance of consistency and normalcy that we took for granted before COVID came in and just really changed everything. So from the beginning, we were able to see throughout the country that African Americans, Latinx individuals, Native American peoples were contracting the virus at higher rates and also having higher rates of death. And this was not just in areas where they comprised the majority of the population, but this was very stark in areas where there were small populations of Latinx minority, communities, but they were still disproportionately affected compared to those individuals who were Caucasian. And so if we kind of fast forward to where we are now, we've learned a lot over the last year, made a lot of changes, put a lot of things into place to try to help people to stay safe and protect themselves. Yet and still, despite all of this knowledge and this information and these changes that we've made, we're still at a place now where African Americans are 3 times more likely to contract COVID compared to our Caucasian colleagues. And we are 2 times more likely to die from COVID compared to Caucasian patients. It's about the same for Latinx individuals. They're a little bit higher in California because they do comprise a larger percentage of the population in California. And it's also a little bit higher for those who are Native American community members. And so again, if we look at the data from the CDC, as well as the data from the California Department of Public Health website, which is being updated on a daily basis, you can go there and see these numbers and see the different statistics. So African Americans comprise about 7% of the population of the state, yet we're 6% of the deaths from COVID. And so, that's something that really, should not be. And as you mentioned, the advent of the COVID-19 vaccine is something that can help us to combat this, because of the fact that if you receive the vaccines that are currently available, the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, are 94 and 95% effective with regards to protecting you from getting COVID and a severe infection from COVID. And there are other vaccines that are currently being studied and kind of coming down the pike, but those are the 2 that are available currently. And we get this question a lot because a lot of people, unfortunately, again, have been affected, even if they didn't pass away. A lot of people in our community at this point have either had COVID or they know someone, a close family member, a friend who's had it. So they say, well, if I've already had it, I've already been exposed to it, then I don't need to have the vaccine. I'm already protected. So you may have been seeing in the news over the last several weeks that there are all these different variants that are coming out now from the virus. And so you may have had the COVID variant that was most prevalent last year, but those antibodies are not going to protect you against getting COVID from one of these new variants that are coming about. And these new variants we're seeing are much more contagious than the initial one was. And so even if you skated by and recovered and did well the first time, it's not to say that that would be the case the second time around. Or the third time, and it just depending on how many variants, how many times you catch it, et cetera. So all of this going back to say the vaccine is something that we know can protect you, not greater than 94, 95%. And it is protective against those new variants as well. So that's what we're really looking at to keep our communities safe.
That's very important because the media can sometimes scare you. With the barrage of information, confuse you and create concerns that are unwarranted and or unfounded. And so receiving that type of information from you is, for me, as good as receiving it from Dr. Fauci, who I believe is God's prophet for this time during this pandemic. If Dr. Fauci doesn't say it, I question it.
Right.
Yeah. So in light of those statistics that you just shared with us, how do we combat 2 things? The first thing is what I call aversion, where African American people have aversions to taking the vaccine, fears, anxieties, hesitancies, some of which are related to historic things that had happened to Black people in America,
right,
particularly the Tuskegee experiment, and then also just general fears because African Americans in large numbers do not go, especially males, do not go to the doctor on a regular basis anyway. Right. Some it's because of poverty, some it's because of access, some is just out of fear and that sort of thing. So how do we encourage our people who are dying the most and contracting the virus the most to take the vaccine?
So I think that that's a really, really wonderful question to ask, because it's very important. That's something that cannot at all be overlooked. And I think that that is something that's starting to be answered a little bit more now. If we look at the different information sessions and things like that were coming out at the beginning of the year, it was kind of more like, take it, take it, take it. But now that we're really starting to see these numbers and this data with regards to African Americans being lowest on the list with regards to receiving the vaccine in the state and throughout the country, now different groups are starting to tailor their message. Whereas, individuals such as myself and, my other African American physician colleagues pretty much across the country, we're kind of like, well, we knew this from the beginning. So this is what our message has been from the get-go. So to really respond to the very valid concerns that African Americans have about the vaccine and about the medical system in general, we have to really be very transparent about the process, and we have to be truthful about why those concerns are there to begin with. So as you mentioned, the Tuskegee experiment, which was put on by the U.S. Department of Public Health, which ran from 1942 to 1972, observing the effects of syphilis, untreated syphilis in African American males. Then there's, the tale of Henrietta Lacks. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with her and her cells being used against her without her knowledge or without her consent in medical research and experimentation, and the list goes on and on. So there is a history of mistreatment that earned the mistrust that is present. And so as medical providers in the medical system, it's incumbent upon us to earn that trust and to regain that trust and to validate the reasons that the mistrust is there. Once we do that, then we can proceed with having the discussions as far as, why the vaccine is safe, why we think people should receive it. And also, I think in that validation and in that transparency, really look at what is the difference between the things that were done at the beginning of, the 20th century compared to now. So we mentioned the dates that the Tuskegee experiment ran from. I mean, it ran up until 72. I was born in 79. So that stopped just a few years before I was even born. So this is fairly fresh for a lot of people. So the difference is now there are prominent African American scientists, physicians, researchers, educators who are at the table. We were not at the table before at the turn of the century when all of these things were being done to our people and to our community. So the first example I want to point out is Dr. Kizzy Corbett, who is an immunologist at the National Institutes of Health, African-American woman, originally from North Carolina. She's been doing research on the mRNA technology that led to the development of the vaccines for the last 6 to 7 years. And so when it came time to make the vaccines, Dr. Corbett actually led the team that helped to produce the Moderna vaccine. And even though she was not directly involved in the production of the Pfizer vaccine, because she had been doing all this research over the last several years, I'm quite sure that some of that research that she laid and the foundation that she laid was also used in the formation of the Pfizer vaccine. So Dr. Corbett, number one, Google her, you'll see she's done plenty of interviews and she's very, very well accomplished. So again, this is someone who was right there leading the team. Next level of involvement, the 4 historically Black medical schools throughout the country. So Meharry Medical College, which is actually my alma mater, combined forces with Howard University School of Medicine, Morehouse School of Medicine, and Charles R. Drew School of Medicine. Yes, I know you're a Morehouse alum. Yes. So the 4 historically Black medical schools came together and made a joint statement last year. And they essentially said, we are going to be actively involved in the process for the vaccine research, for the COVID-19 research, and for, studying the clinical trials and the effects on patients to make sure that we are providing some oversight so that none of these things that have happened historically in the past will be happening again. Currently, Meharry and Howard School of Medicine are in phase 3 of clinical trials for another vaccine that has not yet been approved, but they again have been actively participating in the last over the last year. One other layer to add on to that is the National Medical Association, which is the professional association for Black physicians in the country. So the NMA formed the COVID-19 task force in September of last year, again, to add that layer of we're watching, we're here at the table, we want to make sure that this is being done properly, ethically, appropriately. So they released a statement in December of 2020 with regards to their findings after reviewing all of the vaccine research that was done on Pfizer and Moderna, which were getting ready to have their emergency use authorization approved by that point. And they did not find any inconsistencies or anything to be concerned about, like with regards to their review of the report. So we add one additional layer onto that. So we've got Dr. Corbett and her team, we've got our HBCU medical schools, we've got the NMA, and then last but not least, we have 2 HBCU presidents, the president of Xavier University of Louisiana, which is my other alma mater, and the president of Dillard University. And both of them last year became active participants in the clinical trials that were ongoing, and they encouraged their students, alumni, family to participate as well. They actually caught a lot of heat for that. Because again, this was last summer. So this was when things were still very fresh and new, and people in our community were concerned that they were, in a sense, kind of conspiring, with the forces that had caused us harm in the beginning. But now, if we kind of look to where we are now in February, many HBCU presidents have kind of joined with those 2 presidents in saying, okay, I've received my vaccine. They're posting it on their websites. They're encouraging their alumni and students to receive the vaccine or participate in trials, et cetera. So all of this to say, we have quite a seat at the table now, whereas in the early 1900s and even at the beginning of the 1970s, we were not at the table before. And I'm sure a lot of people are probably familiar with that quote from Shirley Chisholm, where she said, if you don't have a seat at the table, you bring your folding chair. Yeah. So we have plenty of our people there involved in this whole process, really making sure that we are not having a repeat of what has been done in the past.
That's excellent and assuring.
Yes.
Because, for us to be able to have that level, those multiple levels, as you described them, of presence, and there is power in presence, should help all of us. I mean, you identified Dr. Corbett, whom I was familiar with as well in terms of her significant role with the vaccine, and then you know about the HBCU medical schools. That is absolutely huge. Then for NMA, and then for the HBCU, 2 of the HBCU presidents to participate in the clinical trials. I'm hoping that all of you all that are tuning in to this will be encouraged, and that your fears will begin to subside. Again, our numbers of contracting the virus are way up, and our deaths are way up as it relates to the general population. But our vaccinations at this early stage in the vaccine being available are significantly low. And if anybody needs the vaccine based upon the way that it has impacted their community, it is the African-American community and other communities of color, the Latinx community, Native American community, Pacific Islander communities, and other communities, all of color. And that is not a coincidence, that our people end up at the top of some list when it's bad, and at the bottom of other lists when it's good. And so you got to flip that paradigm on its head, and we got to make certain that we really invest. There's some people that normally wouldn't even take the flu shot, in the course of a year, and I'm one of those. I don't ever take the flu shot. But in light of all that this is doing, that this vaccine can do to change the tide for us as it relates to COVID-19, it is something that I think is advisable for leaders to do, so that those that follow them can understand from a visible, tangible example that this is something that can and should be done, and that the side effects are nothing to worry about or be concerned about. The other thing that I'd like to have you speak to, Dr. Sales, is your pediatrician. And so we know that children have been out of school for basically a year now. And it has impacted households and parents and dynamics. Teachers are concerned about going back to school. School districts are trying to figure it out as to how soon we can get back to school. Just say a word as a pediatrician about the importance and responsibility as a parent of taking the vaccine and making sure that your household gets the vaccine.
Right, exactly. No, I think that that's a really, really great question, and one that, of course, we've been getting a lot lately. And fortunately, I would say the one, I guess, silver lining of the fact of this whole pandemic is that it has not affected children as severely as it's affected adults. So not to say that children have not been infected, but they have a much, much, much lower risk of having a severe infection compared to adult patients. So, I think that's one thing that's probably at least kind of helped us to keep going, because people are not scared that their children are going to pass away or something like that. So like with regards to the school openings and, people wanting to know, well, what's the best thing to do or what are the precautions that should be taken? So we've seen in this last year that there's definitely been an adverse effect on kids not being able to have that regular social engagement with their friends, with their teachers, parents not being able to, if parents are working from home, not being able to kind of focus on their work because they're trying to help their kids out. So it's really been kind of a cascading negative effect all around. Of course, again, we have seen a lower transmission rate in kids, like from one household to another because they're not around each other. But there are a lot of things that point towards us trying to work towards getting the kids back into school. The thing that's really been shown to be paramount is that when schools do reopen and they do it in a safe fashion and they do it in a thoughtful manner and really have a good plan for returning to the classroom, as well as a backup plan and a second backup plan, then that's when we've been seeing families be able to return back to school in a safe manner. So the things that we have been doing for the last year just as a community, so making sure to wear your mask, socially distancing, and making sure to wash your hands frequently, those are the same measures that need to be implemented into the schools to ensure that your children remain safe and that the teachers remain safe as well. So at this point in time, the CD's actually made some updated guidelines with regards to that. So at this point in time, teachers or parents receiving a vaccine is not kind of a hard, fast, you got to do this in order to go back. But what we know, looking at the schools that have been open, is that when these measures are done properly, then it does keep everybody involved safe. And so looking towards the future, when the vaccine becomes more readily available to people in younger age groups, et cetera, excluding children, it's not approved for children under the age of 16, but for parents or aunts, uncles, other family members, et cetera, then that'll just, again, be one additional layer of protection to add to your household to know, okay, well, I've received it myself. My husband received it. So we know for sure we're at a very low risk of getting it and then possibly passing it along to our children. Because I'm not only looking at this as a pediatrician, I'm looking at this as a mother who has a kindergartner and a second grader. So I definitely understand where parents are coming from. So what I recommend to families, because of course every school district and every school, things are going to kind of vary, but what I recommend is really just being an advocate for your child and being in contact with your child's school about what precautions are going to be put in place, because when the kids do go back, it's not going to look the same way that it did before COVID hit. So those are, I think, the most important points for parents to just remain engaged and know that there's a plan A, a plan B, a plan C, and then do their part as well to make sure that they're continuing to keep their child's school community safe. So it's not kind of like an excuse to, okay, well, I got my shot, I'm just going to take my mask off and have a big party at my house and then send my child to school, because then you're, again, not really being a productive member of the community and keeping the community safe, and not thinking in those terms. And if we don't do that as a whole, then we will not be able to get back to kind of our normal, the way we were before.
Okay. Now, what about access to the vaccine? So economics continue to play a major role. Accessibility continue to play a major role in America as it relates to impoverished communities, communities of color, both on the political spectrum, and we've seen it in terms of food deserts, the inaccessibility to good, healthy, quality groceries, as well as the inaccessibility to quality health care. And so we've talked a little bit about aversion, those that may have a reason to, be afraid and a little bit hesitant. But what about accessibility for those that already have said, okay, I'll take the vaccine, but, I don't have access to it, whether it's because of age, whether it's because of distance to places and sites. So talk to us a little bit about accessibility.
Right. So we're at a point now where one of the huge rate limiting factors for everybody is supply. Supply from the very beginning has been very limited. I do anticipate that as the weeks and months go by, the supply will improve so that more vaccine will be available for anybody who wants to take it in any place. So that's kind of the first barrier that we're trying to overcome, because at this point in time, the state receives a certain amount of vaccine, then they distribute that to the counties and to the hospitals. And then the county is able to either set up their own pop-up sites, such as the site that's going to be coming up in Mount Calvary, or they'll distribute it to the other hospitals in the community, et cetera. But the flow of the supply has not been consistent. So that, again, is I think, like one of the biggest barriers for everybody, regardless of where you live or what have you. And that's not just something that we're seeing in California, that's all across the country. So then, of course, the second thing that you mentioned is access, because even when they do get their supply and then they do a pop-up, or we have our supply like at Kaiser Permanente, we're relying on patients to schedule those appointments online. And a lot of elderly patients in particular, or patients of color, may not have access to the internet, or even if they have access to the internet, they may not know kind of the ins and outs of trying to schedule something online or what have you. So that's a work that's in progress. And even in kind of being involved in this whole process of the pop-up coming up at Mount Calvary, working with the team to say, okay, well, we've got the link available, but we also want to make sure to have a phone number that's available so that we can, have family members call or set up a group to call and do outreach and have a system for that. And then also, as you mentioned, transportation may be a barrier as well. And so that's actually part of the reason why I really was able to get involved with the group that's doing the pop-up currently, because I knew that we were doing the big site in Vallejo. I knew that we had availability in Vacaville. And I said, well, what about people who live in Fairfield? I have patients who walk to see me from the other side of town because they can't, they're not able to take public transportation, or they don't have transportation of their own. So I said, we have to really make sure that we're going to where people need things the most. So again, that's something that's, I think, definitely a work in progress, something I've been hearing a lot of talk about over these last couple of weeks, with regards to mobile clinics, where county health departments are kind of gathering mobile units and going door to door to give vaccines, or, they're going to like senior centers or whatever the case may be to try to eliminate some of those barriers. And I do, again, foresee that as the supply increases and we're kind of starting out with some of these methods of outreach and some of these methods to overcome the hurdles, that this will pick up and become even more prominent in the future. So, again, if we think kind of back to where we were a year ago, you couldn't even get a test a COVID test. And that was something that was a huge barrier because, again, it was kind of learning and working as we were going. So I definitely think that in the next few months, a lot of these barriers will be removed. We'll have a lot of answers to these questions and things will be a little bit more streamlined. So then that way, access, transportation, city of residence, et cetera, will not be barriers to anyone being able to receive the vaccine if they should need it.
That's excellent. One of the things that I'm proud of, and you mentioned, the pop-up vaccination site that Mount Calvary will be starting on Tuesday, starting tomorrow for us, is really exciting to me because the Black church has been absolutely monumental in the life of the Black community. It is a citadel of hope. It is a refuge. It is a safe place. It is a place of trust for the community. And so persons might feel more safe, literally, going to a church than they might to a clinic or something of that nature. And historically, our churches throughout the country have had to be almost all things our communities in some instances, or very close to it. And so for us to be able to partner with the Solano Public Health and Kaiser to be able to offer the vaccinations at our church is, I think, very, very huge. And hopefully it won't be just a flash in the pan, but that the health department and Kaiser will see the value, particularly in the African-American community, of partnering with churches, because sometimes our people have greater access to their churches than they do to their hospitals or to the clinics within their own particular city or county. And so access is so vitally important. That is something that some other communities, white communities in particular, don't always have a struggle with. Whether it's because they have transportation, whether it's because of proximity, or whatever the other means may be, just seems that they're able to just take advantage of, whatever is being offered without difficulty, whereas our communities have to go through so much because we have so many pre-existing conditions. And I'm not speaking of medical pre-existing conditions. I'm talking about survival pre-existing conditions, so many other things that we're dealing with. Like you said, I mean, it just really surprised me for you to say that you have patients who have to walk from one side of town to the other just to get to your office, to your medical office. I mean, that is, and we're not a major city. We're not Oakland. We're not San Francisco. No, we're not Los Angeles. But even in our city, for people to have to walk from one side of town to the other side of town just to get medical services is astounding. And you just magnify that in major cities, in large places with larger populace. People can easily be discouraged and say, forget it. It'll take me too much to get over there to even get it. So I'll just stay right here and I'll live with whatever happens to me. And we don't want that to be what people have to resort to. We want people to be able to choose life and to have access to life. And that is so critical, particularly for our communities. And so I'm grateful for you and for your intervention and working with us, along with the Solano County Public Health Department, so that we can provide additional access, and prayerfully, as you intimated, as we progress in the country with production and are able to have more vaccines available, prayerfully the numbers will continue to go down in terms of age restrictions or requirements and things of that nature, so that we can finally get to the larger population, and certainly for parents. Again, as we aim towards being able to return to some form of in-person academic education for our children, that we can see things progressing in a significant way. Are there any other things that come up for you that you think are really critical for us to discuss and for individuals to keep in mind?
Again, I think my biggest thing that I always try to go back to is to make sure that people are able to get their questions answered and make sure that people feel empowered to be able to ask those questions and to get the information so that they can make the decision that they feel is best. And I also think that as a pediatrician, I'm kind of in a unique position because I have patients. This is what I do in my practice. I have patients who either are hesitant about vaccines for their children or, you know, they want to do a different schedule or what have you. And so I'm very used to having discussions with parents and, you know, and with the child if they're old enough to participate in making sure, again, that we're all on the same team, we're all on the same page, and the end result that everybody wants is the same, regardless of kind of what the view is at the beginning. At the end of the day, we all want your, you know, as your child's doctor, I want your child to be healthy. I want your child to thrive. I want your child, you know, to grow up and do well. And so looking at this larger scale with this COVID-19 pandemic, as well as looking at the COVID-19 vaccine, at the end of the day, same thing that I would say to anybody who's watching. As a medical provider, I want you to be healthy as a community member. I want you to be healthy for your family, you know, for your friends, et cetera. And that's really, I think, one of the biggest takeaway points. And I do have, people are always asking, well, where can I get information? Because there's so much information and some of it is correct. Some of it is not so correct. And so the link that pops up when you Google is possibly the thing that was clicked on the most, but may not necessarily be the most valid. So I try to encourage people when they want to do research to look at the California Department of Public Health's website that's updated on a daily basis, to look at the CDC's website, which is also updated on a daily basis. It's really interesting to see in the last 4 weeks how much more information is available from these, from the state and from the federal government sites compared to at the beginning of the year. So it's definitely a positive thing, but it's also empowering. So you as an individual can look and see the data, the stats, you know, what's going on. When you look at the California website, you can break it down and see this is what's happening in Solano County. You can break it down and see these are the cases for African Americans, for Latinx, for Asian Pacific Islander, for Native. You can also see the vaccination rates for each individual group. So we're fortunate to live in a state that is breaking down all of the data by demographics as well as by ethnic groups, because some states are not doing that. So that, I think, gives you some additional information just, again, to help yourself to make an informed decision. And of course, especially if you have chronic medical conditions, because people do have conditions or take medications or they have allergies. At this point in time, fortunately, there are very, very few conditions or very few allergies that actually automatically exclude you from receiving the COVID vaccine. But if you're concerned, then I would encourage you to have a conversation with your physician and really kind of go over what that means for you as an individual and weigh the benefits to the risk. The last thing I'm just going to say is just a couple things I've been hearing just from a lot of Black folks in general is, you know, well, I want to see more data. I'm not trying to be at the front of the line. I want to make sure that everything is okay. And I'll admit that when they came around to ask if I was ready to schedule my vaccine appointment, it was actually a little sooner than I thought it was going to be. I thought maybe I would be, you know, somewhere a month or so after we started giving it at Kaiser Permanente, but I was kind of in that first group. So when they came to me, I personally was not ready. I wasn't comfortable saying, yes, sign me up tomorrow. I had to do a little bit more research for myself. I had to really weigh the pros and cons of knowing that there are different variants that are coming out. We're thinking that some of these variants are going to really peak in the next month or so. And knowing the possibility of being exposed to something was going to be greater, possibility of me being sick, you know, or being hospitalized was going to be greater. And I had to take all of that information in addition to some spiritual help. I had a long prayer with my husband, who's a pastor at Brookings AME in Oakland, and another long prayer with my father, who is a pastor at at a church, a Baptist church in San Francisco, and kind of add all that together and say, okay, I am ready to go ahead in there and take my vaccine. And when I did that, and then I received my second dose, and I did have a few side effects, just feeling some soreness and some achiness about 24 hours after my second dose of Moderna. Then I felt as though, okay, I've made the right decision. But again, I just want to be very transparent and say, even as a physician, I wasn't the first person jumping up in line to take the vaccine. But when I really thought about it, I knew that the risk of me possibly getting COVID and having a severe effect and having that impact my family negatively was much higher than the risk of any side effects that may be seen from receiving the vaccine.
That's great. Thank you for being transparent and sharing that with us. That's self-disclosure is very powerful, because the truth of the matter is, even in the medical field, there are many people that are still not comfortable taking the vaccine. And so for you as a physician and as a woman of faith, to understand the role of spiritual counsel and prayer and personal peace is another component that helps us with our aversion, our fears, anxieties, and all of that, our trepidations, so that even if we do have access, that we at least have been brought to a place of peace and comfortability and confidence that God is in science.
Yes.
And the reason that we have science is because God has allowed human beings to acquire knowledge and develop skills that are intended to be benefited by God's people, God's creation. And so, a lot of very, very conservative individuals think that science and God are at odds and faith are at odds, and they're not. They're actually complementary, and actually realize how much more faith you have by even following the science. You pray about it, you get the science, you get all of the data, then you say, okay, Lord, these are the facts. Now help me with my faith.
Right.
And the Lord helps you with your faith. You embrace the facts, and then you move forward. And that's what you did, and that's what all of us need to do. I'm going to take the vaccine. Again, I usually don't even take a flu shot. And even though I've had, health challenges and overcame cancer by the grace of God, other than that, I've never had any health issues at all. But I believe that it's important for me as a leader to take the vaccine and to be an example. And as a pastor preacher who preaches, and in the act of speaking, as we do in the act of singing, sometimes, there can be spray when you're talking and things of that nature. I don't want to put our congregation at risk when we do come back together, in any shape, form, or fashion. We're going to have to adjust our seating anyway, at least for a while, to just make sure that we're clear on the distance that's necessary for safety and all of that. But that notwithstanding, I want to make sure that as a pastor, that I display a love for my congregation as well as a love for myself, to make certain, that I don't in any way pose a danger to anyone else, and that we as a community of faith can be safe in our worship space, which is often that safe place for us, from week to week in our churches. So I want to encourage you again, brothers and sisters, to go on to the California Public Health website and check it out, so that you are up to date on what's happening on a daily basis as it relates to the coronavirus, as it relates to vaccinations. I also want to encourage you to log on to the CDC website to get information. Continue to pay attention to Dr. Fauci, God's prophet during these times, as it relates to this COVID-19 pandemic, and also to Dr. Keedra McNeil Sales, as she has so kindly shared with us such edifying and fortifying information. We're grateful to you, Dr. Keedra, for sharing with us today as you have so freely, and really, really thank God for you and how God is using you to be an agent of healing and of health and wholeness in our community. And so we salute you and give thanks to God for you. Remember, if you have a pre-existing condition of any sort and you are concerned about taking the vaccine, in light of that, consult with your personal physician and discuss it. And if your personal physician says to you that you should take the vaccine, then trust that that is God speaking to you through your physician to confirm that this is something that will be in your best interest. And so I hope that this was helpful. Hope that this was a blessing to all of you all, that you have been enriched as you've been informed, and that you will have peace about your decision as it relates to the vaccination. We can't tell anyone what to do, but we can strongly urge and encourage you, based upon the science, based upon good sense, and then based upon the sovereignty of God that arranged for you to log in to be with us today and to hear this wonderful information. It's not a coincidence. So allow the Lord to lead you, and then you go forward in Jesus' name to be healthy and to be whole, because the word of God says in 3 John 2 that I would that you would prosper and be in good health, even as your soul prospers. And so God wants your soul to prosper. He wants you to prosper spiritually, but he also wants you to be in good health, because your health is your wealth. And so thank you for tuning in. God bless you. May the Lord continue to keep you, and may we all get through this together, so that we all at the Mount Calvary Church and churches around the country and the world may again regather without a second thought for in-person worship and fellowship and Bible studies and ministries to the glory of God our Father. Take care, everybody. Grace and peace.